Hello, everyone. Welcome to Confidence Conversations. My name's Patrick, and actually, on this occasion, we turned the tables on Gail, and I asked her some questions. Um, we really talked about in this session. We talked about imposter syndrome and the differences between imposter syndrome and self-doubt. How everyone possibly suffers from imposter moments, but those really are cases of self-doubt. And what we looked at are, the five different types of imposter syndrome. And Gail also talks about the seven different coping mechanisms for imposter syndrome. Um, a big thing that we focused on was really trying to act as if to overcome imposter syndrome, to not and definitely not fake it till you make it, and to reframe that expression, but in a similar way to act as if. Um, we asked some questions that had been sent in from Gail's community, which were great. And I also asked her a couple of questions, in particular about imposter syndrome versus confidence. And Gail talked a lot about courage there. Um, it was a really nice chat. I really enjoyed being on this side of the podcast. I think Gail perhaps enjoyed it slightly less being on that side of the podcast. But why don't you watch and find out?
So hi everyone and welcome to this special episode of the Confidence Conversations podcast. So today I've invited Patrick back, but not as a guest, as the interviewer, and we are going to turn the tables. And Patrick is going to quiz me. I'm feeling a little bit nervous now, I've got to be honest. Patrick is going to quiz me about imposter syndrome, or we're going to have a conversation about
Yes,
imposter
definitely.
syndrome. So thank you, Patrick, and I'm just going to hand over to you and see where this goes.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Gail. Thanks for having me back on. I mean, I really enjoyed the conversation we had before. So, if anyone's watching, it's a few episodes ago. It was a really good conversation. Really enjoyed it, and I thought that it's perhaps time to hear a little bit more from Gail because certainly I know I probably dominated that conversation as I want to do. I will try not to do that this time. But so yeah, so I thought really what I wanted to do was give you, Gail, a chance to talk on some of these topics because I know you've had lots of guests on, and it's great to listen to their views and their expertise. But maybe it's time to hear a bit of your expertise. So, as you said, what we're going to talk about today is imposter syndrome, and I almost was going to start with saying that sense of nervousness that you're feeling. You're almost feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome, aren't you? But the reality is you're not because it's something very different. And maybe that's a good place for you to start and explain the difference between those two, that sense of nervousness that you're feeling now versus when people actually feel imposter syndrome.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, isn't it, imposter syndrome? And I think and we'll come on, I'm sure, to talk about why I think it's trendy and why I want to talk about it, because we hear it, it's around us all the time. And you're absolutely right. And somebody once said to me a while ago, oh, Gail, have you got imposter syndrome about your imposter syndrome? Is that why you're not talking about it? But actually, there's a distinct difference, but there's also quite a fine line, I think, here. So I don't have imposter syndrome. I'm clear about that. What I do have are those what I would describe as imposter moments, if you like,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
self-doubt.
Yeah,
Self-doubt is the
yeah,
predominant feeling for me of, oh, I'm feeling a little bit nervous. And if you have imposter syndrome, you're less likely to feel nervous and more likely to feel like you're going to be found out, that you
yeah,
are an imposter, you are a fraud. And I make some apology, but no apology for the language that I'm going to use. So I know some people don't like the word syndrome when we talk about imposter syndrome. And I know some people don't like the word fraud. I understand that. But in the terminology that we're going to use today, those two words are ingrained in all of the research.
hmm
So I think
hmm
it's important just to say that I know some people will be like, I don't like the word imposter syndrome. It's not a syndrome. And quite right, it isn't. But that is what it's called, and that is what people know it as. And
yeah.
also
That's
this
how
word,
people will recognise it.
exactly. And this word fraud as well. I know a lot of people don't like that, and I understand that. But
But let's pick up on that for a second, Gail, if
mm,
we can, because the reason you use the word fraud is that people with imposter syndrome, that's what they feel like. They feel like they're going to be found out as a fraud. But But what does that mean for them? Explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, so this word fraud is, and it's a feeling, right? And I think that is the thing here. Imposter syndrome is a feeling, and we'll come on to talk about what makes it up and everything. But the feeling here is, let's say you're about to go and do a presentation, okay? If I'm me, I'm a little bit nervous about this presentation. I know I've done all my work, but I've just got a little bit of nerves. Maybe it's a bit of nervous excitement. If I've got imposter syndrome, I'm going to walk out. Well, actually, I'm probably not going to put myself forward for that presentation or that talk in the first place because I don't want to be found out that I'm a fraud. But if I am going to do that talk, I'll probably spend the whole time thinking that somebody's going to come onto the stage from the audience, grab me by the scruff of the neck and say, "You're a fraud, get out of here." That is how people with imposter syndrome feel. They feel
And
like they are a fraud and shouldn't be there.
they're, in many senses, they're waiting to be found out. They expect to be found out, and they're waiting for that to happen. Is that a fair summary?
That's a very fair summary. They're waiting to be found out. They're always on edge, thinking that they're going to be found out. Yeah.
And you talked about it being a fine line, and I think it is. And having those imposter moments, I think is, everyone has them. I do a little bit of sort of public speaking, and 30 seconds beforehand, you're round the corner taking a deep breath and an extra sip of water, and then worrying that you'll need a wee while you're talking, and then worrying about something else, and then worrying that you've forgotten the first slide and your own name and all those things. But I take a deep breath and then get on with it. I mean, the nerves carry through, and then, but someone with imposter syndrome, that stays with them throughout everything, not even just presenting. I mean, it stays with them in day-to-day stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the point about you carry on, one of the things, so back last year I did some imposter syndrome coach training because I really wanted to understand the truth, because there are a lot of myths out there about imposter syndrome. And I'm going to reference Dr. Valerie Young quite a lot because she is one of the pioneers of the 40 years of research that there is. And she talks about, first of all, we have to normalize imposter syndrome, and then we have to reframe it, and then we have to keep going regardless, which is the bit that you've referenced there, the keep kind of carry on. I want to sing. There was a song, Carry On Regardless, wasn't there? I always want to sing that.
Please don't sing.
That.
It's a very different type of podcast. You come on to that. Yeah.
I won't subject anybody to that. But I think there's a couple of points to make about the going on to do a talk and public speaking. The first thing to say is that, yes, they're waiting to be found out, so they're gonna worry about that. The second thing is they might not put themselves forward for it because of that feeling of being found out. This could be the point where I'm found out. Or they could procrastinate over it for so long that actually that it never happens and it never takes place, because if it doesn't take place, then I can't be found out.
Yeah.
So procrastination is a real coping mechanism sometimes of somebody that has imposter syndrome. And then we could sit here and say, well, I procrastinate. Yes, I do, but I often get over it.
Yeah.
Someone who has imposter syndrome might not do that. They might procrastinate and move on to the next thing and procrastinate about that. Yeah.
One of the things that we talked about a little bit in our last conversation was the difference in confidence often between male and female, men and women. And is that something where imposter syndrome is more prevalent amongst women or other misrepresented groups?
Definitely. Misrepresented groups is a really interesting topic as well, because what can often bring about imposter syndrome is if you are the only one in your group, and maybe the pressure is that you have to then represent that group. Or if you are in a really fast-paced moving environment, so maybe medicine or tech or something like that, and you feel like you can't keep up, there's others, but they would be the two that spring to mind immediately. But the male-female thing is really interesting, because the research back in 1973 by Suzanne Imes and Pauline Clance started actually with women. So when they did this, and it was called imposter phenomenon there, and when they did it, and they did a piece of research with university students who were all female, who felt like they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't have this place at university. And that's kind of where it started. So I guess its roots are in female and how females feel. Over the years, more males have started to say that they, putting their hands up and saying imposter syndrome is a thing for me. But I think there's also a really well-known piece of research, and I can't remember who it is, and a lot of people will resonate with this because they'll have seen it on social media or heard it. But if there's a job description and there are 10 points in that job description, females are going to look at that and go, I've only got 7, I can't apply for that. Men will look at that and go, oh, I've got 7, great, the job's mine. Or to your point, you said to me, they might look at it and go 3, I'll figure it out later. And the fact
I've got 3 of those, that's good enough.
Yeah, because what happens here is men are taught, and I'm using this very generally, right, to say yes, we'll figure it out later, whereas women are more likely to say, let me tell you all the reasons why I can't do it. And it's fascinating, isn't it?
It is, and I wonder if it's worth sort of touching on the sort of, and you mentioned earlier, the sort of trendiness now of imposter syndrome. So it does seem to be a term that people are using more and more, and people are almost wearing as a badge of honor a little bit more and more. It seems to be a thing that is talked about a lot more. I mean, some of that is good, but it's talked about more. But some of that then becomes people that don't really have it are now owning it, and that changes the structure of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, and particularly changes the structure of it for the people that do have it. So I think it's become really trendy, and I think you will hear and see posts and people talking about, oh, my imposter syndrome was really heavy, or it was really at play, and actually I would often question whether, is it imposter syndrome that you've got? Do you feel like you're going to be found out? Or is this self-doubt that actually you are going to carry on regardless, you are going to go on stage, or you are going to do that public talk, or you are going to put that webinar on, whatever that looks like? Or is this really truly something that runs a little bit deeper than that self-doubt? Because I think that it's easy to say, isn't it? Oh, I've got imposter syndrome. Yeah, okay. And for those people that do have it, oh my God, it stops them and it holds them back from doing stuff. And we can overcome that. It's going to take time. But usually, if you're going and doing something with a little bit of nerves, that's self-doubt. And this is where there's a real fine line for me.
Yeah, and this is where, and I think I was hinting at this at the beginning, that self-doubt is a good thing, because for me, it stops me walking on stage as an arrogant arse. Well, because I have self-doubt, fortunately, in many ways, but it forces me to check my notes again. It forces me to take a deep breath. It forces me to look at my notes and check I know the name of the person that's going to hand over to me, so I can thank them by name when I'm on stage. It forces me to do all those little things that then mean when I do start the talk, and I'm using a talk because it's the sort of the easiest example of this. When I do start to talk, then I'm not bowling on stage as like, hey, it's an arrogant arse, and it grounds me for those first couple of slides, and then we get going. Yeah. If it's actually imposter syndrome, I'm not even in the room in the first place, am I?
No, you're not. You're not, because you're worried that you're going to be found out, that you're a fraud. Who am I to say this? Who am I to stand here and do this talk? And I think there's a thing around imposter syndrome that it's a feeling, but it's also a perception of competence. So this person who has imposter syndrome can have all of the qualifications in the world and be the best qualified person to do this talk or to do the, whatever it is they're going to do, but their own perception of their competence is that they're not the right person.
Yeah.
That they're not, that they're gonna find me out. So I'm not. And actually, in some cases, what they might do is they might do a bit of self-sabotage. So they might say, right, I'm going to procrastinate over submitting this presentation, and then somebody will say it's not good enough, and then I'll be like, well, yeah, I knew that anyway. They're looking for the,
or I'll procrastinate so long that I'll miss the deadline, and oh well, never mind. because it was never going to be good enough anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, and I think there's this thing around the trendiness as well, which again was why I really wanted to do the coach training, was to get the facts and understand the research. Is, you know, I've heard it being called a superpower.
I was about to raise that because I know when we spoke before, it's one of the things that you, and I'm using very heavy inverted commas, you love about this, don't you? The superpower.
Yeah, superpower. And I wonder how arrogant that is, right? If you're saying my imposter syndrome is my superpower because it forces me on and it carries me forward. But it doesn't, because if you've got imposter syndrome, it holds you back. Generally, it holds you back.
And this is that fine line between imposter syndrome and self-doubt. So the way I was just talking about self-doubt, actually, it probably makes me a better presenter because I doubt myself enough that I double check and I reread my notes and I learn my script and all of those things. So self-doubt is a positive thing to have. Those little bit of nerves, those little bit of sort of pre-match nerves are really important. Imposter syndrome is the crippling version of that, isn't it?
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, agree. Yeah, and because I would say to you, I'm the same as you. So I'll go along to do a talk or a presentation, and I'll make sure I've got a couple of different versions of it, and I know what I'm saying and what's the room going to be like. I'll do a lot of prep, but I'll still turn up and do it.
Yeah.
I guess I might experience imposter syndrome moments. I can think about one time when I was, my business was quite young. It's maybe the first couple of years. And I remember a company wanted to do behavioural profiling as part of a leadership program. And I remember being told that the CEO that I was going to sit down with had been the CEO or the managing director of something in BT. And suddenly I felt really small, really small. And that for me was an imposter syndrome moment of, oh, this person's, and then I reconciled with myself because I've got self-doubt and not imposter syndrome. I was like, no, actually, Gail, you know your stuff. So you're right, that self-doubt grounds you. To be careful, the self-doubt doesn't hold you back and it doesn't become self-deprecating in that sense. But again, if I was running imposter syndrome, I probably wouldn't have put myself forward for that.
So I mean, how do people with imposter syndrome then move forward? What is one of the things that they can do? How do they overcome this? I mean, you know, people need to try. That's very flippant, but you know what I mean? Yeah.
So I think help is out there. So there are some tools and techniques in coaching, and this is not me pushing coaching, right? This is the first thing I think is recognizing that that's what you've got and talking about it. And this is where the word syndrome comes in, right? Because nobody's going to diagnose, nobody's going to say, oh, I think or they certainly shouldn't be saying, I think you've got imposter syndrome. But in coaching, what I might be looking for are certain words somebody use, some of the avoidance techniques. So interesting, in the research, Dr. Valerie Young identified kind of 7 coping mechanisms. So I would be looking for these kind of things. One of them is kind of holding back, which we've talked about. Something is overworking and over preparing, you know, where somebody does so much work, so much that it kind of, they almost do too much that it becomes really overwhelming. There's this whole piece around charm and perceptiveness because they feel inadequate. So they're overusing their charm. Procrastination, we've talked about it, never starting and never finishing. They might maintain a bit of a low profile or an ever-changing one. So they might job hop. So actually, if I'm getting to the point where I'm going to be found out, I'm going to look for another job because then I can't be found out and I can start all over again. And self-sabotage. So I think in coaching, I'd be looking out for some of those behaviours that are maybe run a bit deeper through questioning. And then I think we'd be talking about how we normalise imposter syndrome and how everybody suffers from those imposter moments. How do we separate those imposter moments from self-doubt? So sometimes when somebody says to me, I've got imposter syndrome, we then have a conversation about that. Because I've not said to them, I think you've got imposter syndrome, they say. So I say, okay, well, let's talk through that then. What does that look like for you? What does it feel like for you? What do you do now to manage it? Where do those feelings come from? Is there a person that triggers that for you? All of those questions that we'd ask. And then we might look for how we might reframe that. So we might look for Okay, so how do you it's really difficult without an example, isn't it? But I might be asking a question about, how might what might be a different perspective on that? If you were looking
Yeah.
down on things and you weren't involved in this, what would you say that looked like? What advice might you give someone else in your situation? There are some really
And
simple things that we can do to reframe.
yeah.
Um,
And
and I know one of the
one of the
things
things,
sorry, go on.
sorry, Gals, I mean, one of the things often is that people with imposter syndrome, generally speaking, have no reason to feel it, in the sense that by all rational measurements, they are in the right place. They are doing the right job. They are
Yeah,
perfectly skilled, and often, super skilled at doing that job. They are in the right room.
yeah,
They feel that they're not. So some of it is some of it. It's a question, is some of it to try and refocus the brain to realize that, to look at that sort of realistically rather than
yes.
imposterly,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
if that's
imposter. We're just
whatever
making
the
up our
word
own
is.
words now.
What the hell?
Yeah, you're right. And one of the things Dr. Valerie Young talks about is being a humble realist, which I really
Hmm.
like. And what she says is the humble realist has a very different perspective on things, on a view of a different perspective, if you like, of their strengths and their limitations.
Yeah.
So, for example, they'll see their competence very differently. So they'll probably understand a bit more what they're capable of, or are able to reconcile that more with themselves. They'll also have a very different view on failure. So
Hmm.
you and I had a conversation about this where we talk about, okay, if I go into something and it doesn't quite work, I see it as, oh, well, that didn't work quite as well as I did. But actually, what have I learned from that? Someone with
Yeah.
imposter syndrome will see that as an absolute failure and will never do that again.
Yeah.
Or they will tell themselves, I'll
Yeah.
never do that again. And then there
Yeah.
is also the bit around self-doubt and fear, and how so you and I, for example, might see that as quite normal. And we've talked about that already. But somebody with imposter syndrome would see that completely irrationally, completely
Hmm.
differently. And it's that then that holds them back. So that combined with the fear, they don't think they're competent. They see failure very different, and the fear of failure, all of that is like a
Yeah.
perfect
Yeah.
storm, isn't it?
Yeah. 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 Which again, coming back to that point, whereas self-doubt is I'm worried that I'll cock up the first line of my presentation.
Yeah.
But that's the sort of, that's all I'm worried about.
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
the rest of it is fine. Every I'm, it's right to be self-doubtful in many ways. I need to practice, but I'm not. It's not that sort of um, almost morbid fear of failing and
Yeah.
being pointed out and being sort of pulled off stage for being a fraud. And again, that's where that difference starts to lie, isn't it?
Definitely, definitely. And I think as well the again, in her research, Dr. Valerie Young talks about that she's identified that there are kind of 5 types of imposters. And when I talk about this, I'm not talking about we're giving somebody a label here like we would in a psychometric test or something. We're not doing that. But what these
Hmm.
are kind of people that hold themselves to really unrealistic standards. And the
Yeah.
5 types are known as the perfectionist. So their primary focus is on how something is done and how it will turn
Yeah.
out. The expert, they have to know everything, everything, and if somebody calls them out for something and they don't know it, then shame on them, as they would see it. The soloist, who wants to complete the task, I should be able to do all of this, should be able to do all of this on my own. The natural genius cares about how and when things happen, and they measure their own competence in terms of ease and speed. So if something's not easy
Hmm.
or it's not done at speed, and then there's the
Yeah.
superhuman, yeah, and if I fall short in any part of my role. So the 5 different types are really interesting because what links them all is this piece around, if any one small minor flaw in any of those happens to me, then I'm a failure,
Yeah.
and I feel
And so
shame.
is some of the way to try and combat this to work out which one of those types you predominantly fall into and almost learn the language and the skills around that. So, for example, and again, I know we had this conversation before, sort of that perfectionist element. if someone asks me a question I don't know the answer, and it's much easier now I'm older and more experienced in my career and all the rest of it, but I'm very confident in saying, I don't know and I'll get back to you tomorrow.
Yeah.
And is almost learning how to say those words one of the ways that you can combat this for yourself.
Yeah, so when we talked about this before, we talked about the whole, and I can't even bring myself to say it, but we talked about the whole fake it till you make it thing, didn't we?
We did.
And
Yeah.
how often do you hear people saying, oh, I've got imposter syndrome, but I'm just going to fake it till you make it. Sorry, that's really flippant. I don't mean it to be, but it happens, right?
I don't hear people say it like that, Gail.
Are you sure? That's how I hear it, right? That's how I hear it.
Well, no, yeah.
So apologies, anybody out there, but there's two things for me. The first thing is I hate the fake it till you make it thing, because it just brings about a whole thing that isn't authentic. There's that word as well.
Well, it comes back to fake and fraud are very closely linked in terms of words, aren't they? And that doesn't help in this scenario.
Yeah, and if you're already feeling like a fraud, to then tell somebody to fake it till they make it, well, hang on, that brings
which
about
is what they feel they've been doing for the last 20 years. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they still haven't made it in their head. So, yeah.
Exactly. So the slight reframe on that, which is where kind of the normalized reframe carry on comes from, is if we just reframe that into act as if, that has a very similar intention, but it sounds very different. So in your example of, I'm in a meeting, somebody asked me a question I don't know, I feel like complete shame because I've not been able to answer that, rather than saying, do you know what, I don't know the answer to that, I'll come back to you as soon as I can. That's the difference for me. So there's this act as if you are confident, because you can change your actions. Your feelings will change last. They'll be the last thing to change. But I think if we act as if we are confident, or we are that person we want to be, then slowly, and it will be slowly, and some things will work really well first time, some things won't. But I think if we do that slowly and we practice and we work on, maybe with a coach or a mentor, we work on this, how we see our competence, how we see our failure, the act as if piece works. And the great example of act as if for me is, we can often name our favourite actor or our favourite soap star, but we don't always know their name. We know the name of the person they play, but we don't know their name. And that's a great example of act as if. They're believable. They've made us believe they are this person.
Yeah. And I'm a big believer in that sense of language being really important, and learning the language around this. Then and you don't have to feel it, but if you say it, other people start to believe it, and then it's reflected back, and you start to believe it because they believe it. It becomes sort of cyclical like that, doesn't it? In a positive way.
Yeah. And this isn't about whereas with self-doubt and things like that, people might have, like my pull up your big pants, people might have phrases that they use that help them. In an imposter syndrome space, that isn't going to be enough, because it runs much deeper than that. So this is going to be some work to really explore and really understand, how do we get to the bottom of this? How do we reframe properly some of these feelings that, you've had for probably quite a long time?
Yeah. Okay. I know we've got a few questions, and I do want to get to those. So I know that people have asked those, so I want to ask them to you and for you to answer them. Before we get to those, is there anything else around this that you'd like to say? Is there anything that I haven't asked, given that I am only a guest host, everyone? This isn't my day job. So is there anything that you'd like to say before we move on to questions?
I don't think so. I think we've covered off quite a lot, because we did say when we met the other day, we should have just recorded this conversation in the coffee shop, because it was kind of what we wanted to replicate. But I think probably as we go through the questions, there might be some other bits that come up. But I think for me, I'd love people to leave this. Maybe they've listened because they think they've got imposter syndrome. And if they have, then help is out there. Go and seek help. There'll be somebody out, and that might be me. That might not be me. Do your research. Go and have a look at Dr. Valerie Young's website. There's lots of proper research out there. But maybe some people might leave thinking they had it, or they did. They've got imposter syndrome, but actually they haven't, and they can manage their self-doubt in a different way. Okay. And I guess that
is a similar sort of point with the first question. So the first question is by Emma Jenkins, and she asks, how might you discern the difference between imposter syndrome, a reality-based awareness of a skill knowledge gap, and your bog standard nerves?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Lovely, Emma, for your question. That's a really interesting one, isn't it? I think we've talked about this actually, haven't we, in kind of our introduction around the difference between imposter syndrome for me is this real piece around you're going to be found out. So this maybe it is for some people a fine line, and maybe for some people it isn't, because everybody's different and everybody will experience this different. But the bog standard nerves probably mean you go off and do the thing anyway. You feel nervous, but you go off and do it anyway.
And I suppose there are 3 points. So Emma's listed imposter syndrome, and that's that being found out. That reality-based awareness of a knowledge gap, in some senses, is just that awareness, and it's either you bluff it through, you don't take it till you make it, but you bluff it through in that meeting, or you accept the gap and you admit it, or you do the extra work beforehand. But that doesn't. None of those things mean imposter syndrome.
No. And actually, if it is imposter syndrome, there might be a risk there that somebody overworks but actually they don't have that knowledge gap.
Exactly. The imposter syndrome is thinking you've got it when you don't have it. Exactly. If it's a reality-based awareness, then it's not imposter syndrome.
Yeah, because you will think, well, exactly like you've said, I can go off and learn that. Yeah. Thanks, Emma.
Okay. So Ali Grady asks, what does imposter syndrome look like when you're experienced, successful, or seen as the expert? How does it change over time?
This is a really interesting question, because I know in the podcast with Ali, you can go back and listen to that. We touched a very little bit on imposter syndrome. And I think for me, when you're really experienced, successful, or seen as the expert, that's a whole lot of pressure if you've got imposter syndrome. Because again, if one of the types is the expert in the research, for example, this is the knowledge version of the perfectionist. And because you expect to know everything, if there's one minor gap in your knowledge that you think you have that you don't, that just brings about a whole load of shame for you. Yeah. And I think the more senior you get, maybe the more lonely it gets. So it's less easy to ask somebody, I don't know this, because they think you should know and you don't. Yeah. So it's a bit of a vicious circle, isn't it?
And in that way, that knowledge gap then perpetuates and always stays because you never ask about it.
Yeah,
and especially if it's not a factual, researchable gap. It always stays because you never ask.
Yeah. And how does it change over time is a really interesting piece, isn't it? Because I think there are two schools of thought around this, and I would say for some people, it comes to I'm of a certain age, actually, I don't really care anymore. And they don't mean they don't care, but they mean they worry less about what other people think. But I would also
There's a bit
think
more sense of what's the worst that could happen sense to it. And I think, and again, we were talking before, I think I've reached that point. There's just that, I think experience teaches me that the worst that can happen isn't that bad after all. Kind of thing, and it's just that, isn't it? And I've got to that point probably.
And I think on that point, that phrase again, what's the worst that can happen? If you've got someone with imposter syndrome and you say that to them, they will think about what the absolute worst is. Yeah. Whereas we might shrug that off as, well, what's the worst that can happen? We'll learn anyway. Yeah. Kind of thing. Yeah. I think the other school of thought around this would be really interesting, and Ali does a lot of work in the mental health space and in the menopause place as well, and I'd be really interested to know, and again I'm saying here, I don't know this, I'm not the expert here, right, but I wonder what the research is in terms of how menopause affects imposter syndrome, because I would think it probably does. It probably has an impact, a negative impact on how women feel, particularly women, obviously, because it's prevalent in women anyway. And then the menopause hits, and then how does that play out? But I think, so I think there's two schools of thought. I think the first one is, well, actually we get to a certain point and we care less, flippant. But actually then there's another point that says, well, what does this mean for women particularly? as they get older, and they do, menopause brings about lots of change in thinking anyway. So there's a bit of research there. There's a bit of a gap, I think, in terms of the research there.
And I think it's interesting. I know you've already touched on this, but I just wanted to come back to that sense of how it changes when you are more successful, because in many ways there's almost more to be found out there, isn't there? There's a greater drop if you're found out in that way. So again, I wonder if that exaggerates things often.
I would think definitely, and I think that's where the whole lonely at the top comes from, doesn't it? You've got the more senior you get, if you like, the more successful you are. You're quite right. The bigger the risk of being found out becomes. And again, that's probably where then the job hopping comes in.
Okay. Melissa Haig sent a question in, and so she asks, so many people talk about imposter syndrome as something to overcome or get rid of. What's your take on that?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Melissa loves a challenging question.
That's a challenging question, yes.
Yeah, I think it's something that you don't get rid of, would be my view. I think it's something that you learn to manage. So in a similar way that you might learn to manage your self-doubt or your inner critic, all of those kind of things, I think once you have identified that you have got imposter syndrome and you want to work on that, then I think you get some strategies and some techniques, whether that's around reframing, that's around normalizing, that's about acting as if. Those things help you to manage that when it starts to come back again, when it starts to maybe be a bit loud, or when you're in situations.
And that terminology of when it starts to be a bit loud, and by managing it in those ways or learning those techniques, again, it's not that you get rid of it, it's that you make it a smaller part of your day-to-day experience. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think it's overcomeable, but probably doesn't go away.
Yeah. Okay. So, and again, this comes back to this sense of syndrome. It's not curable.
No.
It's not something that you recover from in that way, but you can learn to live with and overcome it, as you say.
Yeah. And maybe, I don't know this, I'm just going to put this out there, but I wonder, and maybe if somebody has had imposter syndrome and they feel like they've overcome it, they could drop us a message and let us know, because I'd love to know what they did, and also whether they feel like it's come back, and now does it present itself in a different way, maybe as self-doubt, but actually they've got the humble realist view of it, that they see failure slightly differently, but they're more aware of their competence, and they know that fear and self-doubt is quite normal. That'd be really interesting to know.
Yeah. Okay. And Van der Varga asks, where does imposter syndrome come from? And why is it there? Does it have a function? And I guess, and my sort of point to that is that sort of sense, and we talked about this the other day, that sort of evolutionary function. Lots of things have a sort of hangover from that, don't they? Did it help our cavemen and women ancestors?
Yeah, interesting. The cavemen and women thing. So I think the cavemen and women thing is really interesting from an inner critic point of view, because I think when we've got an inner critic that's quite loud, our inner critic was there to protect us from harm. So when we were cavemen and women, we had to go out and hunt, and it would keep us safe, wants to protect us. And probably the imposter syndrome does want to do that to a point, because it wants to stop us from being found out. But does it have a function? Vanda will have her own views on this. I know she will. But for me, I think the function that it has at the moment is it holds you back. So then, no, that's not a function, is it? Because in the procrastination and the holding back and keeping under the radar, if you really want to achieve and move forward, then no, it doesn't have a function. The question of where does it come from? Well, we're not born with it. It can be a learned behaviour, and that can be very situational. So, where I said right at the top, where we may be the only one of a type in our group, and we feel pressure to represent that group, or we are in a really fast-moving environment, then that might be it. I think there was a really great article, and it's actually on the Imposter Syndrome website, about Michelle Obama who basically said, you know, I was completely different to anybody that had been in the White House before. So I did have imposter syndrome feelings, but this was what I did to get over it. It's a great article.
Yeah.
I think people like Michelle Obama help people to understand that imposter syndrome is quite normal. Let's normalize it. But actually we can do work to come back to the overcoming it.
Okay. I've got a couple of sort of follow-up questions to that. And I think you've
And these
hinted
I don't
at
know. Feeling the
these
pressure.
you don't know. No, these haven't been sent in advance. But you've hinted at that. So one of the things I was thinking as we've been talking is imposter syndrome something that you feel sort of across the board, or are the situations where you feel like an imposter and other situations where you don't? So, for example, you know, I don't know, at work I feel fine, but if someone asked me to go and play football with some good footballers, I feel like I feel imposter syndrome. I don't know, or perhaps more realistically for me, I can present fine, but if someone asked me to go and play golf, a round of golf, I'll feel like an imposter. I
God,
know
that's a
which end of
great.
the stick to hold, but
Are they called sticks? Golf sticks.
I call them golf sticks. Yeah, you hit the little round thing with one of the sticks. You
With the
see, I'm
stick.
actually don't know why I'm an imposter. I'm
No,
brilliant at it.
I think you've got it. It's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because as you were talking, I was thinking where might I have felt. I know I gave you an example earlier, but I know early on in my coaching career, whenever I was in a room with other coaches, I
Hmm.
always felt like I was the least experienced coach in the room. Did I feel like an imposter? I don't know. I didn't ever feel. So actually, no, I do know, because I didn't ever feel like I was going to be found out. I just thought they were all better than me. So then
Hmm.
I've labelled that comparisonitis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But maybe had I have been, I don't know, from a very different background to some of the coaches, or had it come at it from a very different
Well,
angle, might I have then felt imposter syndrome?
that's you touched on it in that sense when you talked about people feeling that they are representative of their group in a different environment, and I
Mm,
wonder if back within their group they don't feel imposter syndrome,
no. Mm.
but they do when they leave their group and become a representative of it.
Yes, yes, that can be a big trigger for it. Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in your group, you feel safe, right? It's
Hmm.
comfortable. You feel safe. You're probably all thinking the same. You're probably all feeling the same. But suddenly, when you're out of that, that feels very different.
And I'm just sort of raising this. I'm sort of thinking it out loud, really. But we talked about finding language to help and acting as if. And language to me within groups, and I obviously my background is marketing and writing, and I love language and exploring ideas around language. Language is often very specific to groups, and it
Mm.
carries through shorthands and thoughts and ideas that you don't need to explain, and experiences and all of those sort of commonalities. And so I wonder if language is actually one of the key things. And one of the things about imposter syndrome is not that you don't have the knowledge and don't have the experience and the skill set, but sometimes you don't have the language to express those and to sit within the group that you have joined.
Yeah, yeah, and I would think that probably comes back to being the expert, doesn't it?
Mm.
In terms of the types and how you perceive your competence. So suddenly you're not that person.
Hmm.
So then I must be an imposter here then, because I don't understand what this group's talking about. So
Or
yeah,
they don't understand what I'm talking about because I'm using the
yeah,
wrong language.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it can be very situational. So, you know, you're definitely not going to feel like, well, I don't think anyone would feel like an imposter doing the washing up. But again, once you get into your chosen area or out of your chosen area, that can then bring about those feelings as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I've got one final question for you. Obviously, your big area is confidence and big pants and so on. So where does imposter syndrome end? Where does extra confidence start? What are the links between the two or the differences? How are they? Are there any obvious parallels? Is there any areas that you want to touch on there?
Yeah, that's a great question, isn't it? Because I think I've said this a couple of times. I think there's a really fine line between the
Hmm.
two, between self-doubt and imposter syndrome. I think there is some confidence and some courage in acting as if.
Hmm.
That I think, there is a moment of, if I want this to change, I've got to go and act as if. I've got to go and, if it's in a meeting, not be small. I've got to be bigger. I've got to put my hand up. I've got to say. So I think there's an area of courage in that. The other
Yeah.
overlaps for me are definitely around reframing, which is
Yeah.
an NLP, a neuro-linguistic programming technique. And Vanda, actually, who sent in one of the questions, one of my favourite phrases that she always uses is around failure, and her saying, well, we either succeed or we learn. And I love that.
Hmm.
But that just those reframes, and I use those a lot in the confidence coaching as well. So there are some overlaps. But I think it's maybe more about courage. If you've got imposter syndrome, courage to move forward, courage to admit that this is holding you back, courage to maybe
Hmm.
admit that you need help, that's a bit
Yeah.
strong, or you need some support, or you need somebody to confide in,
Yeah.
somebody to help you to
Yeah.
normalize that and work through it.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
it's more around the courage, and then the confidence to go off and take action. That
Yeah.
would be the piece
Yeah.
for me.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, I've really enjoyed this chat. We should do this
Thank
again.
you.
Well, I mean, I'm sure we will do it again over coffee. We might not let everyone else, let the world see it, but we will definitely do this again.
Oh, Patrick, thank you. I feel it's weird being on the other side of the podcast desk, but yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks for saying yes, and I genuinely hope that there's some takeaways there for people, and they can always get in touch, and we'll put everything in the show notes, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well to the Imposter Syndrome Institute website, where
Hmm.
you can find out loads more information. If this is something that in the beginning, if you feel you've got imposter syndrome and you think you might benefit from some support, actually reading some of the true research, not the influencer on Instagram or the
Yeah.
post from the famous person. Read the proper
Yeah.
research, because that will start you on your way and help you to start
Yeah.
to normalize that.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent.
Fabulous.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Confidence Conversations podcast.